Welcome everybody. It's good to have everybody back. I want to thank Michelle Smith for this Washington Ideas Roundtable series. I also want to thank Elma Gildenhorn and Joe Gildenhorn who helped sponsor these things. And I really want to thank Jim Wolfensohn for being our guest today. Jim Wolfensohn, as you know, is a hero to the world's poor and downtrodden. He's also a hero to the world's elite, and people go to Davos too often, so you span the entire spectrum. Somebody who has been a concert cellist, an Olympic fencer, a banker, and of course, for a full decade, the president of the World Bank, and a real leader in the idea of development policy in this world. So please welcome Jim Wolfensohn.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This is a wonderful book that's a narrative tale, a global life, and it actually starts with you being dunked by your heels into lime water by somebody who called you, I think we can say it, a little prick.
That's right.
Yeah.
In Australia, that's a term of endearment. I want you to know.
Were they right?
Yes.
Tell me what you learned from that.
Well, I grew up in Sydney, and my father thought that I was growing up in England, so he used to dress me in a proper suit on every occasion. And we went out to a dairy farm where wearing a suit as a kid of 6 years old was not perceived as being the normal dress. And so I was there, and the hand who dealt with the cattle took one look at me and decided that this was not the way for someone to grow up. So he grabbed me by both feet, put me down, my head into this bucket of calcimine, and touch of the suit too, and said, "You're a little prick, you should know how to dress when you come to a farm." And I must say that it had a pretty good impression on me. After that, I dressed correctly.
But you grew up in sort of tough financial straits as you were growing up. And how did that affect you? How did that...
Well, my dad had gone out to Australia from the UK, where he had done but not completed his graduate education. And it was at the beginning of the Depression. And so he made investments that he thought were terrific, except that in the Depression they weren't terrific. So the money that he had, he lost. And so I grew up at a time when there was very little money around. And I became very conscious of the fact that my father was really an outsider because he was an Englishman in the context of an Australian community. And not only that, he didn't have any money. And so we had a pretty tough time. We didn't have a phone, we didn't have a car, we didn't have all those things that my other classmates had. And so for a time I became very conscious of the fact that he was vulnerable. And I'm sure there were a lot of people who were after him for money or for whatever it was that he owed them. And so I became very conscious of this difficult period. Thank God after about a decade he got out of it. Mm-hmm. But in my early years I was very conscious of this issue of not having resources. And so it affected me very much, because I used to think in terms, if I had 10 pounds, that would last me for 3 months. I did it first as a student, but then when I left, even when I left school and went to university, I had a habit of always setting these goals about how I could survive on X dollars if I had bread and cheese or an occasional apple or something. I used to set these objectives, but I also used to, even then, I thought, well, if I can do that, then there must be other people who are unable to do that. And at a very early age, I started thinking about the inequities, and to a degree, I think that probably had a profound impact on the path I chose later.
Mm-hmm. You arrived at Harvard, I think, with $300 in your pocket and no money for tuition, Harvard Business School.
That's right.
And how did you navigate that one?
Well, Harvard wrote me a letter and said to me, I went to Harvard Business School because I'd previously been a lawyer, and I was trying a case with someone from one of the leading American law firms really by accident, because my boss was the leading trial lawyer in Australia, and he had a heart attack the night before the case started, and there were about 2,000 or 3,000 pages of reference material, so it was impossible to bring anyone new in. So this poor top American lawyer had the indignity of having this 22-year-old kid sitting next to him at the bar table. And it was a very big case. It was the RCA Zenith antitrust action. In those days, it was a hell of a lot of money. It was $300 million. Today, it'd be $10 billion or something. But I see Alan smiling. Were you in it, Alan?
Alan Greenspan.
But anyway, the first day went spectacularly. He would ask me questions, and I would say it's on page 67 or page 433, and I'd go to it and I'd tell him, and I just felt that it was easy. Then the next day we went to Canberra and we continued, and at about 11 o'clock in the morning, I'll never forget, he turned to me and he said, "What is the current ratio of such and such a company?" I had not the slightest idea what a current ratio was. I said, "Well, I got the annual report." He got more and more angry. He said, "What is the current ratio?" And I opened up the report looking for current ratio, and of course I couldn't find it. And he then grabbed it from me, and then with some invective, which I shall not use, he said, "Why don't you go to the Harvard Business School?" Grabbed it for me, and I was so embarrassed. I went back that night to the hotel and wrote to the Harvard Business School, Boston, Massachusetts. And 6 months later, I was there. The only thing was I didn't have any money, and I literally didn't have any money. And they wrote back to me and said they couldn't give me a scholarship. They could lend me, I think it was $3,000, but I had to have $3,000 of my own, and I had to get there. Well, I had $300, and so I first wrote to the Minister for Air, because I was in the Air Squadron, and said, could I get a free ride to England? And he got me in, and he said, I mean, this is all too boring for you, but anyway, he got me in, and he said, you want to join the Air Force? I said, no, but if I go to the Harvard Business School, and if there's a war, Australian Air Force will be very much more efficient, which I don't think he actually accepted, but nonetheless, he got me a ride, which is a long story, and I finally got to the Harvard Business School, having somehow managed to get from England there, which is another story. And then I went into the Woman for the Advance in Aid, and I said, Miss Glynn, I have a problem. She said, what's that? I said, you wrote me a letter saying that I had to have $3,000, and I'm afraid I only have $300. And she looked at me, and I didn't know whether she was going to throw me out, and she said, you're a very naughty boy. We, of course, became lifelong friends. She advanced me all the money in the first year, so I got through, and then somehow I ran the laundry service in the second year.
Well, the reason I raise some of these things is, first of all, to show that this is a book of sort of delightful narrative tales, but also because one theme I've kind of noticed in the book is that you're both the ultimate insider in life and the ultimate outsider. Sort of Australian, but British, but Jewish, but then go to Harvard with no money, but then also part of the, being the outsider, being the insider, how does that affect how you think?
Well, that's a very interesting observation. I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. What I think happened was that I went back to Australia after a year or two's overseas work, and there, of course, I related to everything because I was in a top law firm, and then I went to one of the better investment banking firms, and then ran a subsidiary, partially owned subsidiary of Schroders in London. And so I started to, with a strong base, identified with Australia. I see Stuart Braffman here, who was a client of mine from Mortgage Guarantee Insurance. He still speaks to me after 60 years. I can't believe it. Whoops. But the point was that in Australia I felt very comfortable. And then when I went to England, I felt very comfortable because they had an interest in our firm. But I think what really brought about the change, when you talk about the ultimate insider and the ultimate outsider, is that when I went to work in England, I was an outsider because I was not part of the establishment. For those of you, let me start by saying I have a very high regard for the United Kingdom and British and everything. But when you're Australian, let me tell you, you're not an insider. And so that early period was quite difficult, to say the least. And I had a chance, in fact, of running that particular investment bank. And ultimately an earl became chairman, and they wanted me to be chief executive, and I said I had enough of my Australian moxie to say to hell with you, and I came to the United States. And the thing which is so remarkable about this country is that you can be an outsider, but you can very quickly become an insider. Mm-hmm. The difference between insider and outsider in this country, thank God, is not profound. Mm-hmm. There is mobility. And what I found was that in New York, in all the things that I got into, that people accepted you and accepted me for what you could contribute. I never felt an outsider in New York because there's so many people who come to New York. I've never felt an outsider in the United States. And in fact, in my career, I've been given opportunities to do all sorts of things with no reference whatsoever to whether I had resources or whether I had a lineage in New York or in Boston or wherever. The amazing thing about this country, as I've experienced it, is that you are accepted for what it is that you are. Now, I'm sure there are a few clubs that I can't get into, but then I convince myself I don't want to. So I have no feeling of being rejected. But it is true that, that this is a remarkable country. And so when you ask this insider-outsider thing, I don't feel it anymore.
Although maybe one issue in this country is that it's the insiders who are having the most trouble publicly these days. We've become anti-insider, anti-elite.
Yeah, if you use the characterization of elite and insiders in that sense, I think that is probably true. But I don't think it's a class thing. What I don't understand, it may be whether you were born in Chicago or New York or whatever the leadership regards as important. But I think what we're going through now, unfortunately, is that I think that it is. I think we're seeing some evidence that the experience that exists in this country is perhaps not being tapped as efficiently as it might be.
How do you feel how President Obama is doing in that regard?
Well, I hardly know him, but just from outside observation and from discussions with people that are more competent than I and more experienced than I, it does seem to me that he could have a broader reach in terms of bringing in people with him. I don't say this in an egocentric sense because I'm not talking about myself, but I think that this is such a rich country in terms of experience on both sides of the aisle. But if you are trying to run a country from the images that I have of the way things are working, it does seem to me that reaching out more would be a profound improvement on where we are now.
Do you think this administration has a problem with the world of business and finance because of that?
Yes, I do, but I think I hesitate to jump and say it is because it's finance and business. I know some people have said that the president isn't interested because it's finance and business. I don't think he does it, so far as I can see, in many areas. That includes finance and business, but it's not just finance and business. It's in foreign policy, it's in the arts, it's in many, many things. And, you know, I'm not President of the United States, and I'm not prone to give a president advice, but it does seem to me that the remarkable thing about the United States is that it has such a depth of quality people, And when you look at the current administration, it does seem to me to be a bit narrow.
Well, you are very close to President Bill Clinton. He appointed you head of the World Bank. What were his strengths in that regard?
Well, I think his choice of presidents of the World Bank was impeccable.
Yeah. But before you make that a joke, let me ask you why. I mean, because all of a sudden you're in a parking lot and somebody says, I read in the Financial Times you might be president of the World Bank, and your wife, who knows you better than you know yourself, Elaine, says, that's perfect for you. Why was that perfect for you?
Well, look, it's the, you know, I don't want to criticize President Clinton's judgment. As I said, I think it was impeccable. But 15 years earlier, when President Reagan was coming into office, I think it was 15 or 18 years earlier, I'm not quite sure, I was told that I was on the short list. And in fact, Bob McNamara, who was then retiring from the bank, called me into the bank and said, you're on my short list to be president of the World Bank. And I said, Mr. McNamara, I knew him because I was then, in part of my outside activities, I think I was on the Kennedy Trust, Kennedy Family Trust, so I got to know him a bit. And he said, no, you're on my short list. And then it was discovered that I was Australian. So he said, well, you better become American. And I thought that was a big deal, except that with one phone call to Sarah Weddington, in 3 days I was made an American, which I thought was pretty unusual.
Not like England, you could never have been knighted that quickly. Yeah.
I went down to, I'll never forget, I went down to the immigration department in New York, and there was a long queue of hundreds of people, but someone found me and took me straight into a woman. She said, could you sign your name? And I'd prepared for this over the weekend, and I learned all the capitals of the states, and I did all the things that you need to do, and I had my kids ask me questions, and I was ready for this moment. She said, sign your name. I signed my name. She said, good, you've just passed your literacy test. And she said, who was the first president of the United States? So I told her. She said, congratulations, you have now met all the requirements. And I said, please ask me questions. She says, I have no time. I have to get this down to Washington. So that was my experience in becoming American. But the real thing, I think, was that I'm very glad I didn't get it then, because I didn't have the experience that I then got in 15 years in running my own business. And also the experience that I had in my non-business activities, which were various, but which included substantially work in the developing world, including China, India, Africa. And so by the time I got to the bank, I not only knew where these places were, but I'd actually done projects in many of them. And so I could have a good start. But the interesting thing was that I was in competition. Shall I just finish the story? I was in competition with a bunch of other people, as I discovered. And in the parking lot, this guy had said to me, you're on the short list. And my friend Larry Summers had in fact put a note in the Financial Times, or a story in the Financial Times, which was promoting Larry's candidacy. And to make himself look better, he put in a few also-rans as people that clearly were on the list but were certainly not acceptable. And I was one of them. And so the name got out there. And it was because of Larry. I mean, he did quite well afterwards, I might tell you.
It was actually right around that time that we were putting Larry on the cover with you, Alan, the Committee to Save the World.
No, that was a little bit later.
Right.
A tiny bit later. But it was with Larry and Bob Rubin. And what was so funny about it was that eventually it came, I've been going 3 or 4 weeks, and my clients in my business kept saying to me, are you leaving the business? And I got to a point where it was impossible to both be on the list and keep a business going. So I was ready to pull out of this thing when I got a call to come back for for a meeting which Larry had organized, which was to put me essentially in a process that would have taken 3 months to analyze where I'd been for the last 10 years, and I would have never survived. And
this is a vetting process in which it's one of the things we're doing at the Institute is trying to streamline this, but if you're going into government, they say, have you ever traveled out of the country any time in the past 17 years?
That's right, and give us a list.
And give us a list and who you met with, and it becomes a little bit problematic if, like yourself, you have traveled out of the country more than once or twice.
It was so ludicrous. So I thought, well, you know, it's over. And then the phone rang, and the chief of staff of Al Gore called and said, I know what's happening there. Show no surprise, just get rid of them. Come over here at 1 to see me, at 2 to see Vice President Gore, and at 3 you'll see the president. So I was then very polite to the people in the room and said, I will get you my last 10 years of entries and exits from the United States, and got rid of them. I went over to the White House, and Al Gore, first of all, gave me a briefing on environment and on all the things that interested him that he hoped that the president would ask me. And I was getting more and more nervous, and then finally I went in, the president offered me a Coke, and we sat down in the Oval Office with his chief of staff sitting there, and for 50 minutes the president talked about politics, about ball games, about Jackson Hole, about everything, nothing about me whatsoever. And with 10 minutes to go, I said, Mr. President, I said, you know, this is an interview about the World Bank. He said, oh, I know. And I said, don't you want to hear something about my background? He said, oh, I think I know all about your background. So I said, you don't want to hear about, you know, what I think? No, I know about your background. And then I said to him, well, Mr. President, if you know all about my background, I have to tell you one other thing, and that is that if you don't make up your mind in the next day or two, I'm going to resign. I have to get out of here. He said, what? And I said, look, I explained to him the problem. He said, okay, I understand. And I then flew back to Germany. I'd flown in for 1 day from Germany to have this. And the next day, I got a call from the White House at a very early morning. Apparently the president had gotten his staff in. I am told, but I don't know, I can't warrant this, that he went into the group and he said, now, who would be most upset if he really screwed this up? I'm using polite language, but that's more or less what he said. And they apparently concluded that I was so driven that it might be me, so they gave me the job. and that's how it happened.
But what drove you to care about world poverty that way?
Well, I had had the very good fortune when I came to the United States of meeting David Rockefeller. He came to Harvard, and he liked Australians, and I was there with another Australian who was much cleverer than I was. But he nonetheless talked to the two of us. And this was another thing about this country. You know, if I were in London and I wanted to see Lord Snooks, he would never have had anything to do with me. But in the United States, someone as eminent as David Rockefeller took an interest in two young kids who were at Harvard. And we had open access, and I felt very easy going to see David, and it was amazing. And so, what was the question again?
What world poverty?
Oh yeah.
What was driving you to want to do?
I started with David,
poverty?
and he asked me if I would do a project for him downtown, which was to save the Customs House, which is a beautiful building. And then that led to my going on the Population Council board, on the Rockefeller Foundation board, on the Rockefeller Brothers Fund board. There's a whole slew of Rockefeller entities. And I got the seal of approval, and I went into all these things as the young guy who was going to do some work. But with it came the opportunity to visit these countries. And I became passionate about the issues which, as you know, the Rockefeller family has been preeminent of the American families in dealing with these issues, whether it be in China or whether it be in the developing world, Latin America, less so in Africa, but on fundamental issues they were it. And so I benefited enormously from having this patronage. And so I did that, and then I did one or two other non-business things on my own, which led me to continue this great interest in development. I mean, the world has 6.8 billion people now. There's been 1 billion people in the rich world. And there are now 5.8 billion in the developing world. And by 2050, there'll be 9.2 billion people, and there'll still be 1 billion people in the rich world, but there'll be close to 8 billion in the developing world. And these statistics and the fact that the world is so heavily leveraged on the side of the poorer countries is, I have discovered, substantially unrealized in our country. There's an intellectual acceptance, perhaps, but the fact that we're going to have 2 billion Africans in 2050 with an average per capita income of $2,000 to $3,000, when China and India will have an average per capita income of over $30,000, and we will have an average per capita income of over $80,000 or $90,000. These sort of statistics people don't really understand, or the fact that China and India will be the number 1 and number 2 economic powers in the world is not understood, as they were in 1815.
So how does that mean we should change our approach to world poverty or development policy?
Well, it means, first of all, that we need to train our young people to understand something about Asia. We have 350,000 Chinese students studying abroad at universities. You have more than 300,000 Indians studying abroad. We have 13,000 Americans studying in China and 3,100 in India. That comparison is not very attractive in terms of where the world's going. Our kids still go to Europe and Spain and some to Latin America. I'm not saying they're bad things to do, but in terms of in terms of policy about where our country should go and what we should be teaching our kids, we should be aligning them towards towards Asia, which will have 65% of global GDP. We should also, however, be thinking about Africa, because we have a strong Africa connection in our country historically. There are now 900 million people there. There'll be close to 2 billion in 2050. 53 countries. And if you look at our aid budget, or if you look at our education budget, or if you look at damn near anything that we do, I'm sorry, thanks, Walter. I won't say it ignores Africa, but it damn near ignores Africa in terms of policy.
You and I first worked together when I was at the Aspen Institute, at least, when we were doing the U.S.-Palestinian partnership, right, and you were President Clinton's special envoy for Gaza disengagement and the Palestinians. What's gone wrong with the Middle East peace process, and how would you get it back on track?
Well, I was actually President Bush's envoy, which was even more surprising.
Yeah.
But anyway. Well, look, we've had an analysis of this issue and the framework of the solution since Bill Clinton. The sort of deal has to involve both land, Jerusalem, return of the Palestinians, the contour.
Sorry, return of the Palestinians where and how?
Whether the issue is that they will return to Israel as the new Israel will be constituted, whether families will be reunited. The series of issues is transparently clear and has been debated not once but 50 times.
And do you think the solutions are rather clear?
I do. I do think they are. It will involve a reinstatement of certain lands. It will involve a swapping of lands. It will get up to close to the territory that was previously agreed in terms of Palestinian territory. There will be an understanding of Israel as a Jewish state, and there will be some sort of understanding of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but there will also be second part of Jerusalem, which will be the capital of the Palestinian state, and then on the holy places there'll be some condominium that will
What would
emerge.
you do to get us closer to getting there?
Well, if I was President of the United States, which I'm not, I would, I'd get personally involved and try and get it done within the next 12 months, because I think it requires not Hillary and not George Mitchell and certainly not the people that work for them. And I'm not diminishing them, but this is a top-level negotiation. And I think if the president got behind it and gave it the sort of time that President Clinton gave it, there'd be a good chance of doing it. There are two principal problems at the moment. One is that Abu Mazen is getting older, and there is the likelihood, the certainty of change in leadership in the Palestinians. And the other side is that Bibi Netanyahu, who's not up to now been the most malleable of people, has I think, for whatever reason, is keen to try and be the prime minister that does it, but he has a divided cabinet. And the right in his cabinet is a religious right. So
but if he really
needs to bring something together. And the way that could be done, I believe, is if President Clinton drew the line. President Obama drew the line.
Drew the line on what? Settlements?
No, drew the line and said, we're going to get this thing done.
And what gives you evidence that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to get it done?
I'm taking him at his word, which is something that I have not done always. But I think that the contours of his age, the fact that he is in the leadership position, and that he'll never get another chance to do this and leave a place in history, is something that would, I think, speak for the prospect that he would, in fact, follow through. But you have to deal with the religious right, and you have to get C.P. Livni and the Labour Party to come along so that you have a government that works. And I think the only person that can get that to happen is the President of the United States. And I think if you...
Do you think President Obama has that much credibility amongst the Israeli leadership?
Not at the moment, but I think if he spends some time on it, he is the President of the United States.
Do you think Secretary Clinton would be pretty well positioned to do that as well? She
Yes.
She has a lot of credibility, though.
Yes, but she doesn't. She's not the President of the United States. She is the Secretary of State. And I have great regards for the Secretary, and I like her very much, and but I don't think this is delegatable in my experience. I spend a lot of time in the region, and I hear the way they talk, and it is just my personal opinion that this is a job for the President.
And by a job for the President, do you mean calling everybody to Camp David, him going over there, or him just making statements?
Both.
Three, yeah.
Certainly not just making statements.
Okay.
I think he's made a number of statements. I think they're very clear what he'd like to see happen, but I think it is a commitment that he needs to give. But I don't know him well enough to tell him. And if I did, he wouldn't take any notice of me. So,
Raise your hands, please. We'll have some questions on. Yes, Arno de Boschgraaf, with a microphone next to him.
I wonder if you could enlighten us a little bit on what's been happening on a global scale economically and financially, and I'm thinking of South Korea, Beijing and Tokyo. A lot of confusion in the headlines of recent days, and perhaps you could explain it all to us.
if Alan Greenspan would go to the men's room, I'll be very glad to try and do that. Alan, do you want to go out for a minute?
I came to hear you.
Look, my assessment is a modest one, but it is that first and foremost, there is a major swing going on towards Asia. I hinted at it, I spoke about it before. There is a major shift in terms of economic power to the east. In the 30 years before the year 2000, you had 80% of global GDP with the United States, Europe, and Japan. And in the last decade, it's maybe become 70-30. But by 2050, and I wouldn't put my life on this, but the general estimates are that it'll be of the order of 60% plus in Asia of global GDP, with the OECD countries being at a level of, let's say, 35% against the 70 which they are today. That is a huge shift to Asia. Now, I hurriedly say that it could be 10 years later, and I may be out 10%, and I'm not sure that it'll be exactly China and India, and I'm not sure the pace at which they will pass each other or not pass each other. But directionally, I think that we are clearly moving to a nation-dominated global economy. Within that economy, Japan has not progressed as well as it might have, and I think has some problems with an aging population and a diminished technological advantage, which it once had significantly. So I think we're seeing a move towards China, India, and other countries in Asia, including South Korea, that you mentioned. Mm. What I think is also happening is that the issue of Africa will become more and more and more intrusive. At the moment, we can talk about Africa, and the G20 talks about Africa as requiring lots of things, including jobs for young people, microcredit, small and medium-sized enterprise. They didn't come up with any additional money this time. The Koreans got a pretty good statement. But you will have 2 billion people on a planet of 9 billion, more or less, that will be in Africa. And you can't have them, in my judgment, with 10% of the standard of living of China and India, and in terms of us, 2%. That's my opinion. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to come to an adjustment on that. What I think we need to do also in the case of our country is that to be competitive with Asia, we need to certainly take another look at our educational system, and we need to take another look at our economic management. And if you want to know about the economic management issue, then I refer you to frequent articles by the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Greenspan, who will tell you that there is a serious need in our country for some discipline and for a return to a more modulated movement forward, supported by both control of expenditures, but also looking into the development of human resources in this country, if I understand him correctly.
Do you support...
Is that anywhere near right, or is that not? Close? Good,
you want
great.
The microphone?
Close. Well, I'm close. Well, you should continue to read his articles in the Financial Times, and then you'll get it exactly, or listen to him speak. But that is more or less where I'm at, Nano, and I think that we're not recognizing these shifts nearly enough in our country. And the figures I gave you about where our kids are going to study and where they're being encouraged to study, and I could go on and talk about teaching Chinese language and history and the way our history programs are taught, which still Eurocentric to the extent that we teach them, is, I think, just nonsensical.
O'Day Aberdeen.
Are you from the Middle East?
Jim, you talked about the growth in Asia, China, India, also in Brazil. That's going to lead to a depletion of world energy resources. And that's a crisis that we have to think about. I know you have an interest in green energy. Can you give us your views on the outlook for world energy demand?
Well, I think, as you know, that all the projections in terms of traditional energy sources, whether it be oil, gas, coal, are that there will be a redirection of those facilities towards the east as you have an expanding level of income in those countries. And when you multiply it the extent to which you have an individual's income increase by 1.3 billion or by 1 billion, you're looking at what is happening in China and India. And as you have seen, as we've all seen, the Chinese particularly are looking overseas to try and protect resources that are related to energy. And we do not yet have any, so far as I can see, any appropriate plans, particularly as some of the places where there are sources of energy are not in great political shape vis-a-vis the United States, whether it be in Venezuela or whether it be in some other countries. So I think that the issue of sources of energy supply is a patently obvious issue, which the President talks about. what is disappointing is that the level of alternative energy investment and the ability to press forward to get more than 2 or 3% of our total energy demand passed to these new sources, or whether it be on conservation, which would be the quickest way to do it, to try and reduce the demand. I'm not sure that our country has yet woken up to, and I personally at the moment think that we're headed for a major crisis on this. We've seen the crisis in terms of China in the last days on parity of currencies, but I think the issue on natural resources is a very major one that we need to consider. The other natural resource that I think is not often talked about, but which will become very apparent in the coming decades, is water. Water is necessary for all our lives, and whether it is in our continent or particularly whether it is in Africa or if it's in North Africa, and the access to the Nile where you have 12 or 14 littoral states that are drawing water, most of them upstream from Egypt, which has the biggest demand. You have, I think, in the making a tremendously difficult set of problems. And it troubles me greatly that we are inadequately addressing these longer term issues because they're not visible today and they're not immediate political problems for today. And I think if you talk generally about the way our world is being run, we are responding to recent stimuli, but whether it is in economic planning or whether it's in water or whether it's in power, or we're just not taking the longer term steps because they're not visible within the framework of a short political cycle.
Right. Chairman Greenspan?
Jim, you were mentioning the educational inefficiencies in the United States. That's a euphemism. We're really deteriorating in the sense that when I was a child, I got an extraordinarily good education. And as I aged, I was acutely aware that the United States was the most skilled nation in the world, bar none. We're now in a position where we're observing countries like Singapore, Finland, others. What is it they're doing that we're not and should? Because you can't argue that if we were all on the same plateau and teaching the same kids the same stuff, and we're all terrible, then there's nothing to be learned. But is there anything we can learn from these individual nations, most of whom are developing nations, and what is it we could do that they're doing?
Well, Alan, I think that's a fundamental question. I think the last statistics I saw that we used to rank in the top 3 in education. We're now number 17, if I understand, in the global level of education. I think isn't that right? It just came out. Number 17 is the United States now, and sinking, not rising, sinking. And it used to be that the government of Singapore under our friend Lee Kuan Yew used to come to the United States and Australia to learn about education. They took what we want and they don't visit anymore because they are there doing it. First of all, our school years. I don't know how much of this has to do with teachers or unionism or not. First of all, the kids are in school less time, significantly less time than many of the countries overseas. As much as 2 months less time in school. That's one thing. The second thing is that our curricula are not being upgraded on a national basis. There are some upgradings in certain states, but the joining of the curriculum and the training of the teachers is not occurring on a national scale. What Mike Bloomberg was trying to do in New York, he hasn't, I think, with the past chancellor, they've made some interventions, but to call it a success would be, I think, an exotic judgment about what they've done. And by the way, in Washington, we have had a similar problem. People like Donnie Graham have been spending a lot of time on it for a lot of years, but our education system is still declining. And I frankly believe that while we still have some of the leadership in graduate universities, we're seeing two things happen. First of all, in the fields of engineering and science, if you go to graduations, as I do from time to time, I try and go to one big school each year, either to pay for entry or to get an honorary degree or something. But you're very conscious of the fact that 2/3 of the graduates in engineering science are Asian. They're not American, they're Asian. And you look at the PhD students, they're Asian. And it is terrible. Also, 35% of the students...
I'm sorry, why is it terrible?
Because we're not doing it. We're letting the ground go to our competitors. And 35% of their students are studying engineering and engineering-related degrees, which are based on mathematics and scientific training. And then they go home. But that's the whole point. They're then going home. They used to stay, but now they're going home because the opportunities are greater at home, and the Chinese government, as a matter of policy, is now equilibrating salaries for 2 years so that they can get the people back. So I am deeply, deeply worried about the education system in our country, and until we wake up and say we've got 10 years to fix this, because it is a 10-year cycle to take it right through the primary school and get the kids to universities, and at the same time use our best universities to try and both be examples and recognize this issue, I think we're in very poor shape, to be honest.
Judith Kipper, I think it was? Yeah.
And it's a terrible thing to say, but it is what I believe to be the truth currently.
Jim, since the deficit and unemployment, 9.6 plus up to 17% if you count the others, are daggers at the heart of the American recovery and seem to be really troubling people who don't even understand the impact of those two crises. What would you do to fix them?
Well, one thing I wouldn't do would be to increase the deficit. I don't think you can spend your way out of this. I may be influenced by Dr. Greenspan, but I am convinced that is the case. I think we're doing a lot very badly. One of the things that we don't have is the sense of urgency, it seems to me, in terms of talking about the mismanagement of our existing resources. And the fact that we need to take some pain before we get it better. We can't just keep building our deficit. And it's headed to be 100% of GDP, and will certainly be there if we don't do anything about it. And with our currency then degrading, which manifestly will happen, it doesn't seem to me that that is the right way to go about this problem. But that requires very strong leadership at the center. In the recent G20 meetings, as you will have seen, President Obama's notion of spending our way out of it was significantly rejected by other members of the G20, if I read the communiques correctly. I wasn't there, but I think that that's exactly what happened. So there is a very different view being taken around the world. And there is a feeling that we're trying to spend our way out of it, degrade the value of the dollar so we can pay back with less valuable dollars, and hopefully work our way through. I would be surprised if that is the correct approach. So I think what is needed is a really good look in the mirror at ourselves. It was, after all, a Democratic administration under Bill Clinton that ran, I think, the most effective budget surpluses, if I'm correct.
4 years of surplus.
4 years of surpluses.
Would you endorse the outlines you've seen of the Erskine Bowles, Alan Simpson?
I've only seen the outlines and I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't know. But I think I would endorse the outlines of the articles of Chairman Greenspan in the Financial Times and other places.
Yes.
Am I getting it right, Alan?
It's not a tutorial. Here, yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could comment on the use of sanctions in terms of bringing about meaningful political change. Did what work in South Africa apply to states like India in terms of its Kashmir question, or Turkey in terms of its Kurdish question?
Well, I think sanctions are a tool. But I think if you don't, with sanctions, keep the doors open for negotiations, you don't achieve your end by sanctions. First of all, there are very few sanctions that work, because to have sanctions work, you have to have everybody agreeing to the sanctions. And the studies that I have seen lead you to think that you can make it uncomfortable for people with the use of sanctions. But it's not terminal. It's not enough to get a manifest change in behavior. You get statements about behavioral change. But I think all the history shows that sanctions are an element in the armory, but that you have to have going along with it. You have to have going along with it more than that. And so I would say sanctions can be useful, but they're not sufficient.
Can they be useful in Iran?
Well, I think that Iran is an example of how they've gotten around them.
Well,
Isn't
they
that
work
right?
well in Cuba, right?
Well,
I'm joking.
they're still there.
Beverly, Kirk, I think it was, yes.
Excuse me. Just try to turn this damn thing off just a second.
Thank you, Walter. I want to go back to, you mentioned the need for the U.S. to engage more and pay more attention to Africa. But my question is, haven't we already missed the boat given the amount of engagement China's already doing in a number of countries in Africa right now?
Well, China's only been in there for 3 or 4 years. Before that, they were building. I've watched the Chinese situation in Africa very closely in my period at the World Bank, and I was conscious of the town halls and the residences of the presidents and the things that they were doing. But now there's 750,000 Chinese, ethnic Chinese, resident in Africa, and they, in recent years, have brought about a change together with the government in India. It's 3 or 4 years ago that they got the first African heads of government meeting to be held in Beijing. And at the same time, 400 businessmen went to Delhi. And so you had the double whammy. You had the political leaders and you had the business leaders going there. And then they swap around. And they're talking about the $10 billion, or I think it's 10 billion from India, from China, that's going down in aid. These are relatively small amounts relative to the total aid that is already going into Africa. But it's new, and it's without strings, or ostensibly without strings. And so it is the latest
What is the motive
source
of
of money.
China?
Well, first, I believe the motive, first of all, is to secure natural resources. I think that was the initial impetus for China to try and make friends in Africa. And that has been true in the hard metals, and it's been true particularly in oil and gas. And they're very active in those areas. The second thing is that they have very good construction companies. And the third thing is that they have a lot of stuff which they sell.
What is our motive?
I don't know that it's adequately clear, to be honest. I think we feel in a humanitarian way that it's important that Africa move forward. We have a large Afro-American population in our country, and the president, when he went there, was very anxious to point out the linkage between Africa and the United States, both historic and current. And we do sell some stuff to Africa, but we're being beaten substantially by both the Chinese and the Indians at the moment. I think our motive in going into Africa, when I was at the World Bank and when I was dealing with USAID, was significantly humanitarian. And as you know, we lent them a lot of money. But then we went through a stage, which I discovered at the World Bank. After 2 or 3 years, I could see that we were lending X billion dollars a year to Africa. But our total loans were never moving up. The balance sheet was never increasing. And I kept asking, why is it that if we're lending X billion to Africa, and I look at my balance sheet at the end of the year, it's gone up a few $100 million. The balance sheet of the bank was staying pretty constant. And the answer was, well, essentially we're recovering in Africa as much as we're lending each year. The net increase in lending to Africa was very small. So you would go through a $250 million program with some country and you'd get them to agree to do A, B, and C, and they would be very happy and they'd agree to A, B, and C, and then they'd also pay you back $250 million. And it was just absurd. And then I discovered that there was no bad debt provision for anything. And so we had the lunatic situation of a global bank lending to the weakest countries and pretending that there was no risk of bad debts. There was no bad debt provision.
There's a Washington consensus that sort of on how we should be doing things like that. Do you agree with it now?
Well, I agree with it more now because we managed to get rid of $60 to $70 billion of debt. But the follow-up is that you want to then make sure that with the new monies that are going in, that they're spent responsibly and that you deal significantly with the issue of corruption. And we have not dealt adequately with the issue of corruption. And the numbers in terms of not just the United States, but all aid agencies that are putting money in Africa are really extremely troubling. From every $100 which is put out in terms of nominal aid to Africa, probably maybe 20–25% gets to the projects. I've got Jean-Louis Sabib here who used to run this area at the World Bank. Am I more or less right in the numbers, or is that incorrect? Yeah, so it's 20–25%. And if you go to Africa, you find competing aid agencies, you find no coherence in terms of how many schools that are put up. And very sadly, in the aid business, it's an issue of fashion. New people come in all the time. If you look at our own country, the aid administrator lasts usually 2 or 3 years. You have a multiplicity of aid agencies, as you know, 30 of them, and it's just a tremendously inefficient industry. So if you then have China and India coming in with a singular decision that they're going to put $10 million in over a period of time, and you have one group running it, and it's centralized, that is equivalent to a multiple of that coming from us.
Right, right. Yeah, sir, I think right there, and then I have 2 more, and then we'll end it, yes. Oh, hey, sorry, couldn't see you.
You talked about China and India into the 2050s. How do you see the Muslim world, and do you see its relationship with the West improving? And what would you recommend to improve the relationship?
Well, I think the Muslim world, putting aside for the moment the relationship with the West, I think the Muslim world has some problems of its own which it needs to resolve. I think the Sunni-Shia split is not trivial. I think the issue of the related problem on Iran is, while not central to the Arab issue, is still an issue which needs resolution in terms of the weight of economic and political power in the region. And I think the overall question of the thing that I'm closest to at the moment is the issue of jobs and education of young people. I have become very focused on the issue of young Arabs between the age of 15 and 29. There are 120 million of them in a population of 350 million, and another 120 million under the age of 15. And they need more or less 5 million jobs a year. They're getting maybe 2.5 to 3 million jobs a year. And you have increasing inequity in terms of average incomes from the rich to the poor. I think, for me, those issues are hugely more important than the Palestinian-Israeli issue, although the Palestinian-Israeli issue is there. But that's a total of 11 million people, with 6 million Jews and 5 million Arabs and Christians, in a sea of 350 million and in an area which includes Iran and lots of other places, going out to Pakistan with 1 billion Muslims in the world. For me, the issue is not the... I'm desperate to see the Arab-Israeli issue resolved. I spent some part of my life trying to do it. But I think that the issue of Islam and the issue of the resources and the inequities in the system is a huge issue. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the area that I'm doing work in, which is the kids between 15 and 27, I have to say to you that it is my judgment that inadequate attention is being paid in the Arab world to this. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that there are good initiatives that are taken, they are not shared. The Arab world doesn't have a good ability to talk to each other, has been my observation.
Alma Gildenhorn.
I don't know whether you agree with any of that.
It's very interesting, Jim, that 10 years ago at the 50th anniversary of the Aspen Institute, at the end of a week of celebration, you were our keynote speaker in Aspen. And at that time, you were president of the World Bank. And from your position, you talked about the developing nations. You talked about the sense of urgency at that time, and you made the statement that you cannot pull people up by their bootstraps if they have no boots. Here we are, 10 years later, almost a year and several months later, several months beyond 10 years. What are your views now, and how do you feel that the Bush initiative to fight AIDS in Africa has helped the future of that developing area?
Well, I think we've done a good job on AIDS. I don't know what would be the optimum job on AIDS, but I think we've done a good job on AIDS since I first started visiting AIDS clinics, and we're getting out to more people. We certainly are not, we're probably not getting to half the people that we should get to even now, but we are making big efforts. And by the way, the pharmaceuticals have improved so that the effectiveness of what we're doing has improved with what we're distributing. On the broader issue, I feel really a bit of a fraud, because I've been saying the same thing now for 10 years. I don't really have to change my speech very much. There are a few, we can make an improvement in terms of the number of people that live in poverty. But if you raise the level from under $1 a day to under $1.25 a day, and if you look at to under $2 to under $2.50, you still have damn near close to half the world living under $2.50 a day. So you're not seeing a tectonic shift. And if you take, as I said earlier, if you take Africa more particularly, then the numbers go out the window in terms of the numbers. And I worry very much about that. So I'm a bit of a fraud because I made this speech at Aspen. Mm-hmm. And I haven't been asked back since, so maybe...
Working back up to it from DuPont Circle. Last question, Harry McPherson.
Jimmy, you've been talking all around my question, but just to focus it, what's the relationship between development, or the lack of it, and the threat of terrorism? in the world? Does development, or the lack of it, in Yemen and Somalia and these places, does that have an impact on the development and the strength of the terrorist movement?
And developing a development policy, is that a national security interest of ours or a humanitarian interest?
I have a very simple observation on that. That very few, there are some, very few terrorists have a wife and kids that are comfortable at home. That is not altogether true when you look at the group of in the towers, but generally it is true that the vast majority of people who are in daily acts of terror are people that have given up. I personally believe that if you can deal with the question of standard of living, you are attacking in the most effective way the issue of terror. What worries me about the potential in Africa with 2 billion people is that if you have no hope and you have someone clever come to you and say, we'll give your family $500 if you go blow up something, you're a ready target. You don't have to be a genius to know that. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the issue of terror, not totally, because there are some rich terrorists, but significantly, if we could deal with the question of poverty, I think we would help dramatically the question of terror. That is my belief. Yeah. I don't say that it is the total answer, because I don't think it is the total answer, because I think there are other reasons that people want to blow up the World Trade Center. But I think it's something that is an important element.
The book is a global life. Nobody's ever accused you of false modesty, but that understates it. And we're glad you're starting your book tour sort of here.
Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure to have you, and this was absolutely
Thank you very much.
fascinating.
Thank you very much.
I think the books are for sale out there. I assume you'll sign them.
Thank you very much.